Marcus Sullivan wasn't born into power, he built it, brick by brick, deal by deal, until his name was etched into the skyline of Seattle. His empire wasn't just a collection of skyscrapers, it was a fortress of wealth and influence. But beneath the surface, where the lights of his success couldn't reach, another Marcus Sullivan existed. A man burdened by secrets so profound they threatened to shatter the very foundation of his carefully constructed life. To the world, Marcus was untouchable, a genius in real estate, a devoted husband to Victoria, and a father who never missed a soccer game or dance recital. His face graced magazine covers, his words were gospel in boardrooms, and his philanthropy earned him awards at glittering galas. But the applause and admiration were a double-edged sword, masking the truth that haunted him. Because while Marcus lived in the spotlight, he thrived in the shadows, hiding parts of himself he could never let the world see. It started innocently enough, as these things often do. A gala for Seattle's elite, a night of champagne and celebration. Marcus had been mingling, flashing his practiced smile when he first noticed her. Autumn Rose Wells. She was magnetic, not just beautiful, but confident in a way that demanded attention. An interior designer by trade, her work transformed cold, empty spaces into masterpieces of luxury. But it wasn't her professional reputation that drew Marcus in. It was something else, something he couldn't name. Their first conversation was electric, a current running beneath the surface that neither could ignore. Marcus told himself it was harmless, a little flirtation, a brief escape from the weight of his responsibilities. But Autumn wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. She challenged him, intrigued him, and before he knew it, she had become an obsession. At first, Marcus thought he could compartmentalize, keep his life with Autumn separate from his life with Victoria and their two children, Alex and Emma. He told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. Autumn was just a distraction, a temporary reprieve from the suffocating perfection of his public persona. But secrets have a way of growing, feeding on lies and silence until they're too big to contain. But there was something about Autumn that made this secret even more dangerous. She wasn't just another woman. Marcus was hiding from his wife and the public. Autumn was transgender, and their relationship was something Marcus knew would never be accepted in the world he had so meticulously crafted. For all his power and influence, Marcus was deeply afraid of what his colleagues, his family, and the media would say if they found out. The very foundation of his success was built on an image of perfection, one that left no room for anything that deviated from societal norms. Autumn wasn't content to be hidden away. She wanted more, demanded more. And for a time, Marcus gave it to her, believing he could balance it all. But every stolen moment with Autumn was a thread unraveling the tapestry of his life. He knew it, felt it in the pit of his stomach, but he couldn't stop. She had become his addiction, and like any addict, he convinced himself he was in control. The truth was, Marcus had never been in control. Not really. His rise to power had been fueled by an insatiable need to prove himself, to silence the doubts that had followed him since childhood. He wasn't the son of a wealthy family or a prodigy with an Ivy League pedigree. He was the kid who grew up on the wrong side of town, who watched his father's dreams crumble under the weight of unpaid bills and broken promises. Marcus swore he'd never be like him. He'd build something indestructible, something that no one could take away, and he did. But in his relentless pursuit of success, he became a prisoner of his own ambition. Victoria had been his anchor through it all, a constant in a world that demanded everything from him. She was kind, selfless, and impossibly patient, raising their children while Marcus built his empire. She believed in him, trusted him, and for years, he lived up to that trust. But trust once broken is a fragile thing, and Marcus knew he was skating on thin ice. His life was a high-wire act, every step calculated, every move rehearsed. At work, he was ruthless, closing deals that others wouldn't dare attempt. At home, he was the perfect husband and father, his love for his family as polished and controlled as the rest of his life. And with Autumn, he was someone else entirely. Someone reckless, vulnerable, real. But the more time he spent in the shadows, the harder it became to keep the light from exposing him. Autumn's patience wore thin. She'd given Marcus 2 years, waiting for him to decide whether he'd continue living a lie or step into the truth. She wasn't just some fleeting affair. She was a woman who had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, after a lifetime of being told she wasn't enough. She deserved more than stolen nights and empty promises, and she made sure Marcus knew it. The more she pushed, the more he resisted, trapped between the life he'd built and the life he secretly wanted. But secrets have a way of coming to light, and Marcus's secret was no different. It wasn't a question of if it would destroy him, only when. Marcus Sullivan sat in the sleek confines of Autumn's Capitol Hill apartment, a space as bold and unapologetic as the woman who called it home. The city's skyline shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but Marcus wasn't looking at the view. His eyes were fixed on Autumn, who stood by the window with her arms crossed, her reflection merging with the distant lights. Her gaze was sharp, her presence commanding. She wasn't here to play games. "How much longer are you going to keep me hidden, Marcus?" Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of frustration that had been building for months. "I'm not asking for the moon. I'm asking for honesty. Is that really too much?" Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His tailored suit felt constricting, like armor too tight for a battle he couldn't win. "Autumn, it's not that simple," he began, his tone carefully measured. "You know what's at stake. My family, my business. Everything I've built depends on maintaining that image." "That image," Autumn repeated, her voice tinged with bitterness. She turned to face him fully, her expression a mixture of anger and hurt. "What about me, Marcus? What am I supposed to do? Keep living like I'm some dirty secret you're ashamed of?" "I'm not ashamed of you," Marcus said quickly, the words spilling out before he could think. "You know that's not what this is about." Autumn stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "Then what is it about? Fear? Cowardice? You're willing to risk everything for a deal, to take chances on projects no one else would touch, but you can't risk being honest about us?" Her words cut deep, and Marcus felt the sting of their truth. He'd faced cutthroat competitors and high-stakes negotiations, but this was different. This wasn't just about him. This was about Victoria, Alex, Emma. The life he'd built for them, the life he'd sworn to protect, and yet the life he'd found with Autumn felt just as real, just as important. "You don't understand," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "Then make me understand," Autumn countered, her tone softening, though her resolve remained unshaken. "Help me see why I'm supposed to keep waiting while you live two lives." Marcus looked up at her, his expression weary, conflicted. "I'm trying to protect everyone. You, my family, myself. If this gets out, what?" she interrupted. "You'll lose your precious reputation, your carefully curated image of the perfect husband and father? Is that what you're so afraid of?" He didn't answer immediately, the silence between them thick with unspoken truths. Finally, he said, "You deserve better than this, Autumn. I know that. And I'm trying to figure out how to give it to you without destroying everything else." Autumn shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You're trying to figure it out, Marcus? I've already figured it out. You're too scared to choose, so you're hoping I'll make the choice for you. Well, guess what? I have." She stepped back, crossing her arms as she delivered the ultimatum that had been building in her heart for weeks. "You have until Friday. Tell Victoria the truth, or I will." The words hung in the air like a guillotine poised to fall. Marcus felt his chest tighten, the weight of her demand pressing down on him. "Autumn, please," he said, rising to his feet. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," she said firmly. "I won't live like this anymore. I won't let you keep me in the dark while you play the hero in your other life. You either tell her I do. Those are your options." Marcus stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to fight her on this, to convince her to give him more time, but he knew it would be pointless. Autumn had made up her mind, and once she did, there was no changing it. That's what he admired about her, and feared. She was unyielding, unwilling to compromise her worth for anyone, not even him. "I need time," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "You've had time," Autumn replied, "and now you're out of it." She turned away, her gaze returning to the skyline as if to signal the end of the conversation. Marcus stood there for a moment, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she wasn't bluffing. Autumn never bluffed. And that realization terrified him more than anything. By the time Marcus left the apartment, his mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He'd always prided himself on his ability to control every aspect of his life, but this was something he couldn't control. Autumn's ultimatum was a ticking clock, and every second that passed brought him closer to the inevitable. As he drove through the city, the streets blurred into a haze of lights and shadows. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, but he didn't pick it up. He couldn't face Victoria right now, couldn't pretend that everything was fine, because it wasn't. His carefully constructed world was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. And deep down, he wasn't sure he wanted to. The next morning, Marcus sat in his office at Sullivan Real Estate, staring blankly at the financial reports on his desk. James Torres, his longtime business partner, knocked on the door before stepping inside. "You look like hell," James said, his tone half joking but tinged with concern. Marcus forced a smile. "Just a rough night." James raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Instead, he handed Marcus a folder. "Here's the proposal for the waterfront project. Take a look when you can." As James turned to leave, he paused, glancing back at Marcus. "You know, if there's something going on, you can talk to me. We've been through worse, right?" Marcus nodded, the smile still plastered on his face. "Thanks, James. I'll be fine." But as the door closed, the smile faded. He wasn't fine. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Sullivan didn't know how to fix it. Autumn Rosewell's frustration simmered, no longer hidden beneath her composed exterior. Marcus's promises, once sweet whispers of hope, now felt like chains keeping her bound to the shadows. She paced her apartment, her phone clenched in her hand. The ultimatum she had given Marcus was clear, but the days that followed were filled with silence. He hadn't called, hadn't shown up, and her patience was wearing thin. She dialed his number again, her heart pounding as the line rang. When he answered, his voice was clipped, distant. "I'm in a meeting, Autumn. I can't talk right now." "Funny," she said, her tone sharp. "You seem to have plenty of time for meetings, but none for me." "This isn't the time," Marcus replied, his voice lowering. "We'll talk later." "No, Marcus. We talk now," she shot back. "You don't get to brush me off anymore. I gave you a deadline, remember? Friday. That's tomorrow." He exhaled audibly, the tension in his voice palpable. "I need more time." "You've had 2 years," Autumn said. 2 years of hiding, lying, and making me feel like a secret you're ashamed of. "I'm done, Marcus. If you don't tell her, I will." He didn't respond, the silence on the line speaking louder than words. Autumn ended the call, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let him drag this out any longer. He had a choice to make, and so did she. The next evening, Autumn sat alone in her apartment, staring at the skyline as dusk fell. She'd given Marcus every opportunity to make things right, but she knew he wouldn't. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up, seeing Marcus's name flash across the screen. "Meet me at the warehouse on 14th Street, he said without preamble. "We need to talk." Autumn hesitated, a flicker of unease passing through her. The warehouse was a strange choice, far from their usual meeting spots, but she wanted closure. She needed it. "Fine," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll be there in an hour." When Autumn arrived, the warehouse was dimly lit, its cavernous interior filled with shadows. Marcus was already there, standing by a table scattered with blueprints and fabric samples, a weak attempt to disguise the meeting as business-related. She approached cautiously, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. "What is this, Marcus?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. "Another stalling tactic?" "I just want to talk," he said, his tone calm but his eyes betraying his desperation. "I need you to understand how complicated this is." "Complicated?" she repeated, anger flaring. "What's complicated about telling the truth? You're not the only one with something to lose, Marcus, but I refuse to lose myself in this lie any longer." Their voices echoed in the empty space, the tension between them thick. Marcus stepped closer, his expression hardening. "You don't understand what you're doing. If you tell Victoria, you'll ruin everything." "No, Marcus, you've already ruined it," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm done being your secret." As she turned to leave, Marcus reached for her, his hand gripping her arm. "Wait," he said, his voice edged with panic. "We can fix this." Autumn pulled away, her eyes blazing. "No, Marcus, you can't fix this, and you can't control me anymore." In that moment, something in Marcus snapped. Desperation turned to anger, and before he realized what he was doing, he grabbed her again, harder this time. Autumn struggled, her voice rising in fear and defiance. "Let me go, Marcus." The struggle escalated, their movements frantic and chaotic. Marcus's grip tightened, his emotions spiraling out of control. In a sudden, tragic moment, Autumn's body went limp, collapsing to the ground. Marcus froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared at her lifeless form. "Oh God," he whispered, the weight of what he'd done crashing down on him. "What have I done?" He stumbled back, his mind racing. He couldn't leave her here. He had to make it look like an accident, like a robbery gone wrong. Panic consumed him as he staged the scene, scattering belongings and wiping away any trace of their confrontation. When he was done, he fled into the night, his world collapsing around him. The discovery of Autumn's body the next morning sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets reported it as a tragic robbery, but Detective Diana Reeves wasn't convinced. The scene felt off, too calculated. She examined the evidence meticulously, her instincts telling her there was more to the story. Autumn's phone provided the first clue. The text messages between her and Marcus painted a picture of a relationship fraught with tension and ultimatums. Diana's investigation led her to Sullivan Real Estate, where Marcus's carefully constructed facade began to crumble under her scrutiny. The days following Autumn's death were a haze of unease for Marcus Sullivan. At home, the tension with Victoria was palpable, her once trusting eyes now searching his face for answers he couldn't provide. At work, whispers filled the hallways, speculation about his distraction and erratic behavior growing louder. And within him, the weight of his guilt pressed harder with every passing moment. Victoria found the burner phone tucked away in his desk drawer. She hadn't meant to go looking, but the feeling that something was deeply wrong had driven her to act. The messages were all there, fragments of a relationship Marcus had never confessed to. The name Autumn was now etched into her mind, a specter haunting every thought. That evening, as Marcus walked into the house, she stood waiting in the living room, the phone in her hand. "Who is she, Marcus?" she asked, her voice steady but trembling at the edges. He froze, the color draining from his face. "Victoria, I can explain." "Don't," she interrupted, her tone sharp. "I want the truth, not your excuses, not your lies. Who is Autumn, and what did she mean to you?" For the first time, Marcus couldn't find the words. He stood there, his carefully curated facade crumbling under the weight of her gaze. "She was someone I worked with. It got complicated, but it's over now." "Complicated?" Victoria's voice cracked. "Complicated doesn't explain this." Explain this." She held up the phone, the messages glaring back at him. "She gave you an ultimatum, Marcus. What was it about? What were you hiding?" He looked away, his hands trembling. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could handle it, that I could fix it before it got out of hand." Victoria's voice rose. "She's dead, Marcus. Do you even realize what that means?" The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but clear. "Did you kill her?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of a car pulling up outside interrupted them. A knock followed, firm and unrelenting. Victoria's eyes flicked to the door, then back to Marcus. "Who is that?" Detective Diana Reeves stood on the porch, her sharp gaze taking in every detail of the Sullivan home. When Marcus opened the door, she offered a polite but pointed smile. "Mr. Sullivan, may I come in?" Marcus nodded, stepping aside to let her enter. Victoria watched from the doorway of the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Diana's presence filled the space, her calm authority making Marcus's heart race. "I'm here about Autumn Rose Wells," Diana began, her tone professional but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. "We've uncovered some new evidence, and I'd like to ask you a few more questions." Marcus forced a smile. "Of course, Detective. Anything I can do to help." Diana's questions were precise, her observations keen. She pressed him on his whereabouts the night of Autumn's death, the nature of their relationship, and the messages found on her phone. Marcus's answers were measured, but cracks began to show. His hesitations, the subtle shifts in his tone didn't go unnoticed. Victoria listened from the hallway, her heart sinking with every word. She knew Marcus better than anyone, and she could hear the lies in his voice, the half-truths he tried to spin. When Diana finally left, promising to be in touch, Victoria confronted him again. "You're lying," she said, her voice low but fierce. "You think I don't know you well enough to see it? What happened that night, Marcus? What did you do?" He didn't respond, his silence a confession in itself. Victoria turned away, tears streaming down her face. I can't do this anymore. I don't even know who you are. As the days passed, Diana's investigation gained momentum. She pored over the evidence, connecting dots that painted a damning picture. The staged crime scene, the inconsistencies in Marcus's alibi, the mounting tension in his personal life, it all pointed to one conclusion. Autumn's death wasn't a random act of violence, it was personal. Diana's breakthrough came when she interviewed James Torres, Marcus's business partner. James had been loyal to Marcus for years, but the weight of what he knew had become too much to bear. He was meeting her that night, James admitted, his voice heavy with guilt. He told me he'd handle it. I didn't know what he meant until I heard about her death. Armed with James's testimony and the physical evidence, Diana obtained a warrant for Marcus's arrest. The knock on the Sullivans' door came early one morning, the sound reverberating through the house like a death knell. Victoria answered, her face pale as she saw Diana standing there with a team of officers. "We have a warrant for Marcus Sullivan's arrest," Diana said, her tone firm but not unkind. Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, his expression resigned. He didn't resist as they placed him in handcuffs, his mind already spiraling through the events that had led him here. The headlines broke within hours, the media frenzy painting him as a fallen titan, a man whose secrets had finally consumed him. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming. Victoria testified, her words cutting through Marcus like knives. He wasn't the man I thought he was. He lied to me, to our children, to everyone. And now a woman is dead because of it. In the end, Marcus was convicted of second-degree murder. As the sentence was read, he sat in the courtroom, his shoulders slumped, his once proud demeanor replaced by the hollow shell of a man who had lost everything. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Victoria filed for divorce, moving forward with her children and the shattered pieces of their lives. She found strength in the support of friends and family, rebuilding a future free from Marcus's lies. Detective Reeves closed the case with a sense of satisfaction, but not triumph. Justice had been served, but the cost was high, and the scars left behind would never fully heal. Marcus spent his days in a stark cell, the echoes of his past haunting him. He replayed the choices he'd made, the lies he'd told, and the moment he'd let his desperation turn to violence. In the end, he was left with nothing but the weight of his guilt and the knowledge that he alone was responsible for his downfall. His empire, his family, his freedom, all gone. And in the silence of his confinement, Marcus Sullivan finally faced the man he had become. A man defined not by the life he built, but by the lives he destroyed.